Maren Colby did not look up from her folded hands when the laughter went around the road meeting at the Overland house, though every stage man leaning back in those chairs knew she had buried her husband 10 weeks before and driven 40 miles of frozen ruts to stand in the door and be laughed at. She had come to the fall meeting of the Rampart stagemen to say a plain thing out loud in front of witnesses, that she meant to honor her dead husband's contract and carry the United States mail 140 miles over Rampart Pass to the gold camp at Bonanza, 6 days a week through the winter, without the loss of a single sack. For the 90 days that lay between her and the government's winter audit, and she had gotten as far as the words "the mail" before the room decided it was the funniest thing it had heard since the spring the creek froze solid. She stood in the doorway with the $2,600 bond on the Colby line folded in her coat pocket like a second heartbeat, and she let them laugh. And she counted, the way her husband had taught her to count anything that frightened her. Slow. From 1, until her pulse came back down under her own hand. If this is your kind of country, take one quiet second to subscribe and ride along, because what a widow and a condemned stallion did over the 90 days that followed, across a chained bridge, a fouled spring, a sawn break, and the first blizzard of that hard winter is the kind of run the Rampart told on itself for the next 50 years, and told wrong every time. The meeting was held in the long dining room of the Overland House at the county seat, because the Overland House had the only table in the country long enough to seat every line under one roof at once. And the smell of it was cold coffee, and wet wool, and cigar smoke gone stale. 24 men filled the chairs, division agents and independent whips, and the 2 bankers who held paper on most of them, and Maren had come in the side door out of the sleet in her good gray dress with her chin level, which the country had long ago decided was pride, and which was in fact only the discipline of a woman who had learned that, if she let her face move at all, it would move all the way. She was 32 years old that autumn. She was not a large woman. Her hands were a harness maker's daughter's hands, and there was a white line on the 3rd finger of the left one where a wedding band had worn the skin for 9 years and then been sold, in the second lean spring, to a jeweler in Bonanza who gave her $9 for it and looked sorry about it, which was more than most. Now Ms. Colby, that was Vint Cardwell, who chaired the meeting because his father had chaired it, a soft, heavy man who was not unkind and not much else either. Nobody here doubts your grit, Lord knows. But a mountain mail route in the dead of winter is a hard thing for a full outfit of seasoned men to hold together in a good year, and this has not shaped up a good year. There's no shame in letting the contract lapse and selling your coaches and stock for what they'll bring against your bond. The bond is $2,600, and everyone at this table knows it, Maren said. Her voice was low, and it carried, because she had pitched it to carry off a moving box behind 6 horses and did not have to raise it now. The contract pays $4,000 a year to carry that mail, and the express on top of it. Let it lapse and I've sold my outfit at a loser's figure and I still owe the bond, and my winter is 5 months long. I can do the arithmetic on the difference, Mr. Cardwell, so can every man laughing. That quieted a corner of the room, because it was true, and because a stage town will forgive a woman almost anything faster than it will forgive her doing sums out loud. But it was into that particular little silence that Harlan Vance chose to unfold himself up out of his chair at the head of the table, and the room turned to him the way iron filings turn, because Harlan Vance was the stage business of the territory the way weather is a country, the largest thing in it, and the thing every smaller thing arranged itself around. He was 56 that year, and men called him the Stage King, and he had earned the title honestly enough, one bought-out line at a time, until the Vance Stage and Express carried the mail and the express and the passengers on every road in the territory, but the one Gideon Colby had beaten him to years back, the Rampart Road, over the pass to the gold at Bonanza. The richest short route in the country and the only one Vance did not own. He wore a good black coat and a fine pearl gray hat, and he came around the end of the long table with his hat already in his hand, which was the most dangerous thing he did all day. Because Harlan Vance with his hat off was Harlan Vance being kind, and his kindness had cost more men their outfits than his anger ever had. "I'm going to say a thing out of turn," he told the room, "and Maren Colby can show me the door for it if she's a mind." He turned to her, and his face was broad and weathered and genuinely warm, and that was the worst of him. "Girl, I stood at Gideon's burying 2 winters ago, and I meant every word I said over that grave. Your husband was the finest man ever held a set of lines in this territory. And if he'd lived, you'd not be standing in a sleet-storm doorway, and neither would I be saying this. But he did not live. And it is a cruelty, not a kindness, to let you kill yourself on that grade the same way it took him, and lose the outfit into the bargain, when there's an easy way through that lets you keep your pride and your good name both." "Say the easy way, Mr. Vance," Maren said, "so the witnesses hear it." Something flickered behind the warmth, quick, like a trout under ice, and was gone. "I'll take the line off your hands," he said, spreading both hands wide to the room. "I'll assume the Bonanza contract. My coaches run near that country regardless. And I'll pay your bond in full at the bank tomorrow morning, so it's off your neck before the deep snow. In exchange, you turn over the mail contract, the Cold Spring Relay, and your share of the Gaunt's Crossing Bridge, which are no earthly use to a widow with no crew, and you keep your house, your driving team, and your husband's good name. You winter easy. I've had my lawyer draw it fair." He looked around the table, collecting the nods he had grown there like a crop. "That is a Christian offer, and there's not a man here would call it otherwise. There was not." The room hummed its agreement, and one of the bankers looked at Maren with the particular pity that is 3 parts relief it is not him. It was, laid out flat on that long table, the whole of Harlan Vance's genius. He had offered, in front of 24 witnesses, to save her, and the price of being saved was the contract, the relay, and the bridge, which were the only 3 things on the Rampart Road he had ever wanted, and without which the route was a house and a team and a view. He would pay $2,600 to a bank and take back a mail line worth 10 times that, and the country would remember for a generation that he had done it out of the goodness of his heart. Maren looked at him a moment, and then she looked at the bond in her hand, and then she did the thing that decided the next 90 days, which was that she folded the paper back into her pocket and shook her head once, slow, side to side, the way you tell a horse no when yes would hurt it worse. "I thank you for standing up at Gideon's grave," she said. "I'll not sell his road off the back of it. I'll carry my own mail on my own contract, and I'll run it clean and on time to the winter audit. And then I'll come home and pay my own bond over my own counter." She turned to the room, and for the first time she let a little of it into her voice. Not much, a hairline. "I came here asking no favor, and I'm leaving with none. But I'll ask you to remember, when it's told, that I stood in this door and said I'd carry it, and that Mr. Vance stood at that table and offered to see that I couldn't." It was too fine a line for most of the room to feel the edge of, and Vance only smiled and set his hat back on his silver head, which meant the kindness was over. But Vint Cardwell felt it, and looked down at his own soft hands, and old Judge Alonzo Petrie, who was at the county seat riding circuit and had come to the meeting for the coffee and not the coaches, took his cigar out of his mouth and studied the small gray woman in the doorway with a new and unlaughing attention, and filed her away, the way a judge files a thing he suspects he will see again under oath. She walked out through the wagon yard where the overland kept its through teams, and she did not let her hands shake until she was up on the seat of her own light wagon and out past the last lamp of the town, and by then it was only the sleet. Gideon used to say a team reads your hands before it reads your voice. And a town is only a team that talks. And in the 2 years since the staircase took him, the coach off the grade in the black, the break gone, Gideon and a drummer from Helena killed, and Dan Cutter the only man to walk off that mountain, and the country calling it drink and bad luck, though Gideon Colby never drank a drop in his life. In those 2 years Maren Colby had given the country nothing off her hands at all. Not at the burying, not at the 2 lean springs, not when the bank turned the bond over in her fingers like a thing already spoiled. She had held a mail contract and a string of good horses and a crew together with her own 2 hands and whatever wage she could scrape. And she had heard herself called the Widow Colby in the voice men use for a gate that hangs crooked. And she had learned exactly one lesson from all of it, which was Gideon's lesson, and it was this. Any horse will pull on the flat. The grade asks what he has left when the load turns to kill you both. She said it to herself now, out loud, on the cold seat, the way she said it most days. And then she gathered the lines and clucked to the team and drove the last miles home to the Rampart division under a sky the color of a gun barrel. And the last 2 miles the road ran along the pole fence of her own horse pasture, and beyond the poles in the last of the light, the driving stock stood dark and gathered against the coming weather, good honest coach horses every one. And standing off from them, alone, at the far corner of the fence where he always stood, the one horse the whole territory had told her to shoot. Smoke was a grulla, 8 years old that fall, the color of wood smoke over slate, a cold mouse gray dun with a black mane and black legs, and a dark stripe run down the length of his spine, and he was near 17 hands, and built like a bridge, deep and heavy and powerful through the shoulder, and there was nothing gentle looking about him from any side at all. Down his long face ran a blaze, but not the soft, clean stripe of an honest marked horse, a jagged, pale fork of it, crooked as a crack of lightning frozen down the bone, so that the country, which knew a great deal about horses and almost nothing about mercy, had looked at that face exactly once, 2 years back, and decided everything it intended to decide about him. Man-killer, they called him. Outlaw, a cold-eyed rogue that had put a breaker under the ground and would do it again, a horse to shoot and be done. The truth of it, which no one but Gideon had ever troubled to learn, was smaller and worse. A hired horsebreaker named Sackett had contracted to gentle the young stallion for a rancher 2 years back, and Sackett was the kind of man who broke a horse the way you break a stick, with a snubbing post and a quirt and a twitch and his own bad temper, and the stallion had refused to be broken that way, had fought the post and the quirt to a standstill day after day, until Sackett in a rage had gone at him with a loaded whip butt, and the horse had struck out the one time, and Sackett had gone down under his own bad footing and his own drunk balance, and been hurt past working. Not killed, though the story killed him soon enough with drink. And the country, which needed the horse to be the villain, because a horse is cheaper to blame than a man is to pity, had told it ever after that the grulla killed a man, and set the price of him at $1 and a bullet. They had come for him twice, the men who buy cheap horseflesh for the killers, $1 cash for the man-killer, take him off your feed bill, and both times Gideon had run them off the place, and both times he had said the same thing to Maren after, standing at this same fence. Sackett taught that horse that a raised hand means pain, and the horse believes him, and he's dead right to. But he never once struck the hand that fed him. There's not a mean bone in him, Maren, there's just a whole lot of memory. Gideon had bought the stallion for that same $1 himself rather than see him shot, and had spent 2 years teaching him, an hour at a time, with a still hand and no rope, and a pocket of cut-oats, that in this one place on the earth a lifted hand meant only a scratch at the jaw, and had gotten him gentle as a foal to the 2 people who never struck him, and left him an outlaw to the whole rest of the world, and had died before he could make anything of it. And Maren had kept the horse through 2 lean springs, when $1 was $1. and could not have told the bank or the meeting or her own tired self exactly why, except that when she stood at that fence in the worst of the dark, broken, alone, and 40 miles from a friend, the great cold-coated Stallion would come the length of the pasture to her, without being called, and lower that lightning-struck face and breathe against her shoulder. And it was the only thing in the Rampart country that had never once, not one time, laughed. A mail line the length of the Rampart wants 6 drivers and as many hostlers and a station keeper at every swing, or near it, and Maren had spent the summer quietly making her arrangements the way Gideon had taught her, a word here, a handshake there. So that when she drove into the division yard the morning after the meeting to hold her crew together for the winter, she believed she had 4 drivers promised, and her hostlers and her stations set, and she found out inside of an hour that she had almost none. She found it out the way you find out most things in a stage town, in pieces, off men who would not meet her eye. Ab Sneed, who had driven the upper grade 2 winters for Gideon, had taken on with the Vance line for the winter run at $70 a month, which was 20 over the wage and about 30 more than the work was worth. The Purcell brothers, who she had counted on for the swing stations, had been told by somebody they respected that a mountain mail bossed by a widow was a good way to freeze to death and be laughed at doing it, and had reconsidered. One by one, all that week, in the feed store and at the wheelwrights and on the church step, her crew came apart in her hands. And not one man of them had been threatened, not out loud, because Harlan Vance did not threaten. He hired, he suggested, he let it be understood, and by the following Saturday the word had gone all up and down the Rampart that driving for the widow Colby was a thing a sensible man did not do, and the widow Colby had, by her own count, 2 people left on the whole line who had not been bought away, an old crippled-up woman at the top of the pass and a black hostler no other outfit in the country would pay a fair wage. Zeke Doss was the hostler, and he was the best one in the territory, and he could not draw a top hostler's pay anywhere on the Rampart for the one reason that had nothing to do with his hands. He was a broad, soft, deliberate man of about 45 who had come west after the war with a government mule outfit and never gone back, and he had forgotten more about a horse and a set of harness than the Purcell brothers would ever learn, and Gideon had hired him head hostler at the same wage as any white man on the line, and, as Zeke told it, never once made a speech about it. He was in the harness room oiling collars when Maren came in out of the cold that Saturday, and he did not look up from the work, and he said, before she could open her mouth, I heard, "You come to tell me to take a Vance wage before the door shuts. I'll save you the trouble of asking. I ain't going." He set the collar down and looked at her then, level. Gideon paid me like a man for 9 years. I don't know how to be worth less than that of a sudden just account of, he's gone. I'll stay for the $1 a day, and I'll stay for nothing if it comes to that, and I'll tell you the one true thing nobody at that meeting told you, which is that you got exactly 1 horse on this place, strong enough and smart enough to hold that grade in the deep snow, and the country told you to shoot him. He picked the collar back up. So, where do you want to start? Maren Colby stood in the warm harness smell, with the sleet melting off her coat, and she came nearer to crying at that plain speech than she had come at the burying, and she did not, because that was a rule she had. We start, she said, by hiring the men the country threw away. They're the only ones left whose wages Vance never troubled to buy. Zeke nodded slow, as though she had finally said a sensible thing. Then you best go see Dan Cutter first, he said, and get the worst of it behind you. Everybody else will be easier after. She went to Dan Cutter last in her own mind, which is to say she had thought of him first the night her crew fell apart and had spent a week finding reasons not to. Because going to Dan Cutter meant sitting a horse in the yard of the man the country said had killed her husband and asking him to drive for her. That was the whole cruel shape of it, and she did not pretend to herself it was any other shape. Dan Cutter had been driving the down coach the night it went off the staircase. Dan Cutter had walked off that mountain in the dark, carrying the drummer a mile down the grade on a broken hand before the man died on him anyway, and had sat by the wreck till first light with Gideon's body and the mail he would not leave, and had told the coroner's jury over and over, in the flat voice of a man past defending himself, that the brake had gone, that he had set it hard into the first switchback, the way he had 1,000 times, and it had let go under his boot like it was made of paper, and that he had ridden the runaway down 4 turns of that grade fighting for the wall, and lost it on the 5th. And the country, which had a rich man quietly suggesting otherwise, and a cheap answer ready to hand, had decided that Dan Cutter had been at a bottle, the way a careless Jehu will, and lost his nerve and his team and 2 men's lives on a grade he knew cold, and it had crossed the street on him for 2 years, and Dan Cutter, being the kind of man he was, had never once stood up in a barroom and told it back. She found him mending harness in the cold, in the door of a hardscrabble shack up a dry draw, with his coat off, and he straightened when she rode into the yard and stood holding a hame strap and looked at her without surprise, as though he had been expecting her for a week, which perhaps he had. Mr. Cutter. She stayed up on smoke, because a thing like this is easier said from a horse. I've the winter mail to carry over the pass, a contract worth $4,000 a year, and a bond that eats my outfit if I lose it. Vance has bought off every driver in the country. I've a hostler, a station keeper, a weighbook, and no whip. I'm told you were the finest set of hands ever held the ribbons on the rampart before they hung the staircase around your neck, and I'm told most of what they hung there was a lie. He was quiet a moment, and then he set the hame strapped down on the block, careful, and said the thing she had come there braced to hear him not say. It wasn't a lie that your husband died with me driving, Ms. Colby. Whatever else. His voice was low and even, and it cost him. I set that brake. I've set it in my sleep every night for 2 winters. I don't know to this day how it let go, and there's not a soul in this country believes it did, and I stopped trying to make them a long time back. So before you say another word, you best hear me say that one, because I'll not take a wage off Gideon Colby's widow under any softer accounting than the true one. I was driving. He died. That's the fact the rest has got to be built on, or not at all. Maren Colby looked at him a long moment from the back of the condemned horse, 2 of the country's guilty verdicts sitting there in the cold yard, looking at each other. And then she said the thing she had ridden a week's worth of nerve to say. My husband gentled a horse this whole territory swears killed a man, because he took the trouble to find out it was a lie a drunk told to save his own name. I've had 2 years to learn that the country will blame the cheapest thing standing when a rich man wants it blamed. It blamed the horse. It blamed you. She let that sit. Gideon set that same brake 10,000 times, and it never let go once. It let go the one night the Vance line wanted your down coach in the canyon. I don't know yet how to prove that. But I know it the way I know my own hands, and I think, Dan Cutter, that under everything you know it too, and have been calling it your fault, because a guilty man can at least sleep, and a robbed one just lies there. I'm not offering you a wage. I'm offering you the one thing Vance can't, which is a chance to hold a set of lines on that grade again, in front of every man that crossed the street on you, and carry Gideon's mail through where it took him. I'd be obliged if you'd be my whip. He was still a long moment, looking not at her, but at the great cold horse she sat, at the lightning-struck face and the calm eye, and something in his own still face moved. That the Grulla, he said. It was not a question. The one they all say killed Sackett. The same. He never. Dan Cutter reached down and picked his coat up off the block and shrugged into it, and that was the whole of his saying yes. He never did say it in words, then or later. I seen Sackett work a horse, he said, settling the coat. A horse that put that one under the ground did the territory a mercy, and this one never did it anyhow. I was there the day holding a wheel. And Sackett fell drunk off a chute rail and blamed the colt to the men that come running. He looked up at her, and there was something bleak and steadying in it. You want to drive a thing nobody believes, hitched to a horse nobody believes, over the grade that made liars of both of us. Ms. Colby, I don't guess there's a job in the territory I'm fitter for. When do we roll? The crew that came together that next week was, person for person, exactly what Zeke had promised, an outfit of the thrown away, and the best $400 a month of horse sense and hand and heart in the territory, if you knew how to look, which the country did not. There was Maren and Zeke and Dan Cutter, and there was old Ma Renfrew at the top of the pass, and there was the Grula. Ma Renfrew kept the lonely halfway swing at Cold Spring, a stone and log station just under the summit where the down teams were changed and the passengers thawed and fed, and she was past 60 and bandy-legged and crippled in one hip where a frightened team had run over her a dozen years back, and she could no longer climb to a box. But she could feed 12 half-frozen travelers out of one iron kettle in a howling gale, and keep a relay team grained and blanketed through any weather God sent. And she had been living on the grudging charity of the country, in a lean-to behind the Cold Spring Corral, since the Vance agent told her she was too broke down to keep a Vance station. When Maren rode up the grade to ask would she keep the Cold Spring swing for the Colby line through the winter, at $1 a day in her keep, the old woman turned away to the fire so the younger would not see her face, and banged the kettle, and said in a voice like a rasp on cold iron, I fed that mail line 11 years before they decided a wore-out woman couldn't. You put your relay in my corral, missy, and it'll be grain to the minute, and there'll be hot coffee on this hearth the night the whole rest of the world freezes. Now get out of my kitchen. I got bread down. And that was Ma Renfrew's yes, and it held through everything that came. They ran the first mails of that season through a cold, bright week at the end of October. And if the country could have watched the crew work, it would have stopped laughing that week instead of later, because a good outfit working easy is a quiet thing, and this outfit, thrown away as it was, worked like water finding its level. Maren drove the lower division herself, learning the road under her own hands the way she had only half known it in 9 years of riding beside Gideon. And she found out for certain in those first runs what she had only guessed in 2 years of chores, that the condemned Stallion was the finest coach horse on the place. She put him in at the near wheel, the anchor of the 6-horse hitch, the hardest and most trusted seat in the team, where a horse holds the loaded coach back on the downgrades with his own hindquarters and his own weight and his own nerve, and Smoke took to it the way a thing takes to what it was made for. The cold temper that no whip could rule made him fearless of the country's worst. He did not shy at the drop-off, or the wind off the snowfields, or the thunder of the wheels behind him, because fear had been beaten at him so long and so hard that he had simply, somewhere in the 2 years of Gideon's still hand, set it down and refused ever to pick it up again, and he leaned into the breeching on the staircase turns and held 2,000 pounds of coach and mail off the necks of the leaders with a patience that made old Zeke, watching the first down run come in, take off his hat and stand holding it. Look at that, he said, to no one. Man-killer. That there is the best wheel horse I ever set eyes on, and this whole country would have fed him to the Fox Farm for $1. Lord, what we throw away. And in the evenings, when the down coach was in, and the team stripped and the stock turned into the corral, the great Stallion would stand a little apart the way he stood apart from everything, and Maren would go to him in the last light, with the way book still in her coat, and he would lower the lightning-struck face and breathe against her. And she would stand there a while in the cold with her forehead against his jaw, and that was the whole of what she had, and it was enough to go on with. Maren learned her road in those first weeks, and the road learned her, and the learning went the one direction that matters, which is that the crew stopped watching to see if she knew her business and started simply doing theirs. She knew horses. Knew horses. That was the thing the country had never once asked about the widow Colby, because the country had decided what she was the morning they buried Gideon and had not troubled to look again. But she was a harness maker and horse trader's daughter who had grown up under the benches of a Missouri wagon shop and pulled her first bad tooth on a coach horse at 11 and driven a 4-up before she was grown, and she had ridden and doctored and kept the books beside her husband for 9 years on this very road, and she read a team the way Zeke read one. Off the set of their ears and the swing of their traces, and the way they came into the collar of a morning. On the third day, when she said at the cold spring change that the off-swing horse was going tender in the near 4 and wanted pulling before he soured the whole team on the grade, Zeke ran a hand down the leg and found the gravel bruise she had called from the box, and pulled the horse. And after that, when Maren said a thing about the stock, the crew moved before they looked. She learned the stakes of the thing in those weeks too, standing in the Bonanza yard at the far end of the run, watching the camp come down for its mail, and it taught her why a rich man would saw a break for a road. Bonanza was a gold camp of 4,000 souls at the head of a played-out gulch that had come back to life on a court strike, and the Rampart line was its one thin thread to the world. The mail, the express, the bank drafts, the mine payrolls that came up under a guard in the through boot every other Friday. The letters home, and the letters that called a man home. It was the richest short route in the territory, and the only one Harlan Vance did not own, and every sack she carried on time was a nail she drove into his wanting it. She understood, watching a miner take a letter off her with his hat in his hand, that the mail was not freight. It was the one promise the country kept to its lonely. And a man who would break that promise on purpose to steal the carrying of it was a colder thing than a road agent, and she stopped, about then, thinking of Vance as a hard businessman, and started thinking of him as what he was. And she kept the watch. Gideon's heavy silver stage office watch had lain 2 winters in a drawer, stopped, and the first dark morning she took the lines she had wound it, and set it, and hung it on its worn steel chain, and after that she wound it every dawn and ran her road by it. Because Gideon's first law of the line, said so often she heard it in her sleep, was that the mail runs on the watch, and not the weather. That a coach a man can set his own clock by is a coach the country will trust with the thing it loves, and a coach that comes when it feels like it is a coach the government relets. So she drove to the minute, forded rivers and doubled tired horses and climbed grades in the sleet to hold a schedule that any sensible outfit would have let slip. And she blew the mail into Bonanza of an evening on the battered brass horn Gideon had carried. 1 long and 2 short at the mouth of the gulch, the way he always had, so the camp knew its thread had held 1 more day, and the first evening the horn came down the gulch on time, after the whole country had bet the widow could not do it. Men came out of the saloons and the assay office to the boardwalk to watch the Colby coach roll in behind a condemned outlaw horse, dead on the minute, and did not say much, and went back in thoughtful. The first test came on the 9th day, and it was the break, which on a mountain mail is the only test there ever really is, and it came where they meant it to come. On the staircase, in the failing light, with a full coach. Maren was driving the uprun with 3 passengers and the through mail, and Dan Cutter riding messenger on the box beside her, and they had topped the grade and started down the switchbacks with the near-wheel horse leaning into his work, when she set the brake into the first hard turn, and the long oak brake beam let go under her boot with a crack like a shot, and the pedal went to the floorboards. Dead. And the loaded coach surged forward down the grade onto the necks of the wheelers, with nothing on God's earth to hold it but 6 horses, and 2 people, and a mountain that wanted them. What happened in the next 4 turns Maren remembered ever after in pieces, the way you remember a fall, but 2 things she never forgot, and never told any other way. The first was Dan Cutter's face going white and old in 1 instant. because Dan Cutter had heard that exact crack once before in his life, and had ridden the next 4 turns of it into the wreck that broke him. And here it was again. The same grade, the same sound, the same runaway building under him in the dusk. And for one heartbeat she saw the 2 years come up in him like water and nearly take him under. And the second thing was the horse. Because a runaway coach on a grade is stopped by exactly one thing when the brake is gone, and that is the wheelers throwing their weight back into the breeching and holding, and a sound, nerved, honest coach horse will do it as long as its nerve holds, and then it will panic and bolt and pull the whole team and coach off the mountain doing it. And Smoke did not have a nerve to lose. Maren threw her weight onto the lines and called him back by name, low and steady, the one voice on earth he trusted, and the great Grula dropped his hindquarters and set his black legs and threw the whole 17 hands of himself back against 2,000 pounds of runaway coach, and held. And the off-wheeler caught his courage off the near one and held with him, and the leaders felt the check come back down the lines and quit their bolting, and Maren and Dan Cutter and the horse rode that dead-braked coach down 4 switchbacks of the staircase at a hard-held walk, the wheel horses skidding and setting and skidding and setting on their haunches with the sparks flying off their shoes, until the grade let out onto the flat below the last turn, and the coach rolled to a stop in the road, with the horses blowing great plumes in the cold, and the 3 passengers inside white and silent and alive. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Dan Cutter climbed down off the box on legs that did not quite hold him, and went to the near wheel horse's head, and stood there with his scarred hand flat on the Grulla's neck, and Maren heard him say something to the horse too low to carry, and when he came back around to the boot he had the broken brake beam in his 2 hands, both pieces, and his face had changed. He held the parted ends up to the last light and looked at them a long time, and then he looked at her, and he said, in a voice gone very quiet and very hard, "Ms. Colby, come look at how this wood broke." She came, and she looked. An honest brake beam that fails under load, fails the way honest wood fails, splintered and torn along the grain, a jagged ruin. This beam had broken clean across better than half its thickness in a single flat straight line, pale and smooth, and only the last inches of it were torn. The tearing of the little sound wood that was left after something had cut 9/10 of the way through the beam, and left it to part under the first hard break on the first bad turn. In the smooth flat face of the cut, when Dan Cutter tilted it to the light, there was the fine parallel scoring of a saw, and packed down into the low corner of the kerf, dry, a little pale drift of sawdust that 4 turns of a runaway had not shaken loose. "That's a saw cut," Dan Cutter said. "Somebody laid a fine saw into this beam in the dark and cut it 9 parts through, and greased it or waxed it so it wouldn't show, and set it to let go on the first grade under a load." He was not looking at the beam anymore. He was looking down the dark grade at the country he had carried 2 years of a lie across. "Ms. Colby, that's what I set my boot on the night your husband died. That exact thing. That crack. I've heard it in my sleep 2 winters and told myself I was a drunk that dreamed it. I wasn't drunk. I never in my life." His voice broke clean across once, and he mastered it. "They sawed my brake. They sawed it the same as this. And they've just now done it to you." Maren Colby stood on the cold grade with the sawn beam in her hands, and the alive passengers murmuring behind her, and the horse that had held them all blowing in the traces, and she understood 3 things at once, the way you sometimes do, and they came in a rush that left her cold to the bone. She understood that her husband had been murdered. She understood that the man the country called his killer had been telling the flat truth for 2 years to a country that had a rich man's lie to prefer. And she understood, folding the 2 pieces of sawn oak into a grain sack, with hands that had gone perfectly steady, that whoever had done this had just handed her, without meaning to, the first true piece of the thing that would someday hang him, if she was fool enough to keep it and wise enough to use it. She put the sack under the seat, and she got the passengers down to Cold Spring and Ma Renfrew's fire, and that night, late, she took Smoke and rode up the rise above the division yard, where Gideon was buried under a plain sandstone slab she had lettered herself, and she did a thing she had not let herself do in 2 years, which was to tell him the whole of it out loud. She told him about the meeting, and Vance's kindness, and the crew bought off, and the thrown-away outfit, and the bond, and the 90 days. She told him she had found Dan Cutter and hired him, and that the country was wrong about him the same as it had been wrong about the horse. And then she told him the new thing, the thing that changed the shape of the whole world, which was that she knew now his death had been no accident, that a saw had cut his break the way one had just cut hers, and that she was going to carry his mail through to the audit and find out whose saw it was, if it was the last thing she did in this life. She said it dry-eyed, because tears were a rule she had, but she came nearer to breaking it up on that dark rise than she had at the grave. The answer, such as it was, came up the slope behind her on a led horse, and it was Dan Cutter, who had seen her ride out and had not been able to let her go up there alone with what they had both learned that day, and who stood a respectful way off with his hat in his hands and said, "Beg pardon. I couldn't rest, knowing you was up here with it by yourself." "Stay if you want," Maren said, not turning. He'd not mind the company. He always did say you had the best hands on the road, and hated that he couldn't pay you what Vance could. Dan Cutter made a sound at that, low, that might have been a laugh in a man who had forgotten how, and came and stood by the stone, and read the lettering, and was quiet a while. Then he said the thing that was his whole apology and his whole vow at once. I carried him a long way that night. Ms. Colby. Down the grade in the dark. I want you to know I never once put him down till there was men to take him. I couldn't save him. The break was gone before I ever knew. But I never put him down. And Maren Colby, who had needed for 2 years to hear exactly that, from exactly that man, and had not known it, turned around on the dark rise and looked at him, and said, "I know it now, Dan. I believe you. And we're going to make the whole country believe it before the snow's off that grade." And they rode back down together in the near dark, with the horse walking easy between them, and she felt, for the first time since the staircase, not less alone, but alone in far better company. The sawn break told Maren what she was in, and after that she ran the line the way a soldier holds a line, which is to say, she stopped being surprised. She had every brake beam on every coach pulled and sounded, and the doubtful ones replaced with green oak. Zeke shaped himself in the harness shop, and marked in a private way so he would know his own work again, and she took to sleeping 4 hours a night and driving her own runs, and Dan Cutter's both when the schedule pinched. And she wrote every mile of it down. That was the other thing she did, and it was Gideon's thing. She carried his waybook against her breast the whole season, and set down in it each night, in her own square hand under his the run and the time and the weather and the mail. Every sack numbered out of the county seat post office, and numbered in again at Bonanza. Because a waybook was the one thing on a line that did not care about your name or your sex or a rich man's opinion, and because she had begun, without quite saying it to herself, to keep a record that a court could someday walk up the road beside her. In the front of the book, where over 9 years Gideon had penciled the private geography of a mailman, the fords and the grades and the bad ground and the places the wind came off the snowfields, there was a soft page she had read 100 times in 2 years of grief for the man and not the words, and on it, in the slow square hand, was a line she was about to need. Gaunt's toll bridge closes some winter one of these years when Vance buys it. And when it does, the old freight ford's still there below the willows at the south bend, hard bottom, crossable in low water. Trust the horse on the water and he'll find it. Trust the horse on the water. She had thought it a keepsake. It was a map. She needed it inside the fortnight. Because the second move came at the bridge, the way the whole country crossed the Roaring Fork. At the toll span at Gaunt's Crossing, where the river ran too deep and cold to ford a coach, and every wheel on the Rampart Road had crossed on the planks for 11 years. $2 a coach, and posted and legal. She brought the down mail to it on a gray afternoon, and found the gate chained, and a man sitting a good horse in front of the chain with a rifle across his saddlebows. And behind him on the planks, a scatter of Vance riders lounging at their ease, and the man on the good horse was Roof Tolliver, the Vance line's road boss, and he was smiling the small, dry smile of a man who has been paid in advance to enjoy his afternoon. Maren marked him the way you mark a rattler after a season of dealing with a bull. Vance was appetite dressed as kindness. Tolliver was nothing dressed as nothing, a spare, sallow, pale-eyed man of about 40 up out of the Nevada brush, with no history any man could name, who did not raise his voice, and did not need to, and who wore, coiled at his saddle where another man wears a rope, a length of bright fence wire and a fine flat file, and wore them in plain sight the way a townsman wears a watch chain, because he wanted them seen. Afternoon, Ms. Colby. He touched his hat with 2 fingers. Bridge is closed. The Gaunt Bridge is a public toll span, Mr. Tolliver. It's been open 11 years. Company that owns it took a new partner last week. Tolliver's smile did not reach the pale eyes. Mr. Vance bought controlling interest. New toll got posted Tuesday. All legal, filed at the county. Mail coach is $50 the crossing, cash, on account of the extra wear a heavy government coach puts on a man's planks. Reckon a widow's good for it, 6 days a week. He let that sit, patient as a man watching a snare. Or she ain't, and the mail sets on this bank, and the government reads in its book that the Colby line don't cross the Roaring Fork no more. Either suits Mr. Vance fine. It was $50 a crossing she did not have and could not make, 6 days a week, and it was, as he said, all legal, filed at the county, a private company's private toll on its private bridge. And there was no court in the territory that would open that chain for her before the winter audit, which was the entire point. Vance did not need the toll to be lawful past the audit. He needed it lawful for 90 days. Maren sat the near wheel horse she had unhitched to ride up to the gate, and she looked at the chain span and the idle riders and the wire and the file coiled at Tolliver's saddle, and she felt the whole shape of it settle over her, cold and complete. The meeting had been the joke, and this was the trap, and there would be more of it. Each thing legal, each thing deniable. Each thing costing her a day or a run or a sack she could not spare, until the calendar did Vance's work for him, and he never once had to be seen to be unkind. "You tell Mr. Vance," Maren said, and she kept her voice flat and pitched it to carry to the men on the planks, that I heard him at the meeting offer to take my line off my hands as a kindness. And you tell him I've now seen the shape of the kindness. And you tell him the toll's too rich for the Colby line, so I'll not be crossing his bridge. She turned the wheel horse's head. Come morning you can tell him I crossed his river instead, and it cost him $50 less than nothing. Tolliver's smile thinned. River's belly deep and running ice, ma'am. There's no ford this side of the falls for 20 mile, and the old one below's been gone since the freshet. You'll drown that mail trying, and yourself after it. You let me worry about the ford, Mr. Tolliver, Maren said. You never in your life knew the water in this country the way my husband knew it, and she rode back to the coach and left him sitting there. And she did not let her hands shake on the lines until the willows hid her, and then only a little, and only the once. They dropped the coach down the river a mile in the failing light to the south bend, where a stand of bare willows leaned over the water, and before full dark Maren took Smoke down alone to the bank and stepped off and gave the great horse his head. Find it, she said, low, the way Gideon would have said it, and she felt the stallion change under her hand, felt the cold nerve that no whip could rule turn, on the edge of that black water, into a kind of listening. He put his nose down to the current and worked along the bank with his ears going and his forefeet feeling, reading the river by the one thing the country had never once credited him with, which was the judgment of a creature that has learned to trust its own feet over any man's fear. And 30 yards below the willows he stopped, and blew, and stepped down off the low bank into the river, sure as if there were a floor under the water. And there was. A gravel freight Ford 2 feet under the cold push of it, hard-bottomed, angling across to the far shore at the exact slant a coach could hold, the Ford Gideon had crossed on years before Vance ever thought to buy the bridge. Maren sat the horse in the middle of the roaring fork, with the ice water tugging at her boot and the far bank coming pale out of the dusk. And she put her hand down on the wet slate-gray neck and said her husband's name out loud, once, and the stallion's ear came back to catch it. They took the down mail across at first dark, Smoke in at the near wheel, and Maren driving, and Dan Cutter walking the leaders' heads through the water with a lantern, and the coach swam its wheel hubs and held the sunken ford and came dripping and whole up the far bank into Bonanza, with the mail dry and on time. And did it again the next night, and the next, until the crossing of the roaring fork below the willows became a thing the Colby outfit simply did in the dark, while the Vance line's chain hung useless on a bridge nobody paid to cross. It cost them an hour a run and a wetting and the risk every time, and it was the first thing that season the country began, very quietly, to talk about the other way. That the widow Colby had answered a $50 toll by fording an ice river in the black 6 nights running and never wet a sack. It was on the third of those crossings, waiting out a squall in the willows, with the coach on the far bank and the fire small, that Dan Cutter told her the thing that was. She understood later, his whole reason for taking her wage, and it was about Gideon. He said it looking at the fire, and not at her, the way he said everything that cost him. You want to know why I hired to a widow that had every cause to bar the door on me, he said. It's on account of your husband was the one man in this territory that didn't. After the staircase, when it was all over the road what I'd done, or hadn't, and every man in the county seat bar turned his back when I come in, I went in there one night to drink myself past caring. And Gideon Colby walked the length of that bar and set his glass down next to mine, loud enough for the room, and he said, I hear the break was gone before ever you knew it. I hear that from a man that has set 10,000 breaks and knows what a good one sounds like letting go. And he drank his whiskey next to me with the whole room watching, and never said another word about it, and walked out. Didn't have to say more. He knew. He was the only one that troubled to know, and I never got to pay him back for it, because they put him under a sawn break of his own before I could. He was quiet a while, turning his hat. So when his widow rode into my yard on a horse nobody believed and asked me to drive a road nobody believed I could, I figured that was the paying back. Come round late. That's all. That's the whole of why. Maren Colby watched the fire a moment and did not embarrass either of them by answering it straight. He kept a page in his book about you, she said finally. Front of the way book, where he set down the things about the road worth keeping. Under the fords and the bad grades there's a line in his hand that says, Cutter's the best set of hands on this mountain and the country's too proud to know it. Hire him back the day they let you. I read it 100 times and thought it was just Gideon being kind. She looked across the small flame at the man the whole territory had crossed the street on. It wasn't kindness. It was a true entry in an honest book. He was telling me who to trust before he knew he'd need to. And Dan Cutter looked at her once across the fire, and then away, the way a decent man looks away from a thing that is not his yet, and put another stick on the flame, and neither one said anything more. And out in the dark the great horse cropped the willow grass, and it was, for that hour, Enough. So the Vance line stopped being lawful and started being dark. It was the relay that told her the game had changed, that Vance was no longer content to make her late, and had begun to mean her real harm. She came up the grade one bitter evening to change teams at Cold Spring, and found Ma Renfrew white and shaking at the corral gate. Because the fresh relay team, 6 good coach horses grained and blanketed and ready, had been got at in the night, not stolen, which would have been a crime a sheriff could chase, but fouled, fed something in their evening grain that left them down and groaning and blown-bellied in the cold. Past pulling a grade that night, and maybe past pulling one ever, and there was no proving who. Because horses take sick. And it was the sort of thing that happens, and it had cost her the fresh team on the one grade, where a tired team meant a wreck. Ma Renfrew was near to weeping with the fury of it. I set up with him, she said. I heard him go down in the dark and I couldn't. This hip I crawled out to him on my hands and there weren't a thing to do. Somebody come over my back fence in the night and doctored my team's grain Missy, and I'll cut the hand off him myself, do I ever learn the name. And Maren stood looking at the 6 poisoned horses in the lantern light and did the sum she did not want to do, which was that she had a loaded mail coach at the top of a pass, no fresh team to bring it down, and one horse on the whole place who could take a wheel and go straight back down the staircase he had just climbed without rest. And she put Smoke back in the traces he had not been an hour out of, and drove the down mail off the summit on the strength of 1 condemned stallion and 5 tired horses at a walk in the dark, and made Bonanza by midnight, and the great horse came in with his head still up and his ears still working, having done the work of 2 horses on a grade that had killed better outfits with fresh ones. Ma Renfrew's poisoned team lived in the end all but one, and after that night old Zeke Doss slept in the Cold Spring hayloft with a scattergun and a lantern, and no more grain was fouled, but the message had been sent, and Maren had read it plain. They were past trying to make her late. They had begun trying to break her. She understood the whole of it. Finally, the night of the first hold-up, which was the night the map of the thing came clear to her all at once and cold. The upmail was stopped a mile below Cold Spring in the black timber by 2 men with flour sacks over their faces and pistols out, road agents, or men dressed as road agents, and they took nothing of the passengers and nothing of the express box, which any honest thief would have taken first, and took instead only the padlocked-through mail sack, the government mail, the one thing on the coach worth nothing to a robber, and everything to a rich man who wanted the Colby line to lose a mail, and they melted back into the timber and were gone, and the sack was reported robbed. And the government's cold book at the county seat got its first black entry against the Colby contract, mail lost to road agents, Rampart route. Maren sat the box in the dark timber, with the empty leather mail boot open beside her, and Dan Cutter beside her, with his hand on his gun he had not been fast enough to reach. And she did not rage, and she did not weep. She did the arithmetic, out loud, low, the way Gideon had taught her to do arithmetic when it frightened her. "They don't mean to delay us," she said. "I've had it wrong all season. A man that only wanted us late wouldn't foul a spring or take a mail, too much chance of a court asking why. Vance means to have this contract. He means for the Rampart route to look robbed and wrecked and cursed, a route no widow can hold and no government can trust, so that when the audit comes the mail agent reads a book full of lost sacks and late runs, and a driver the country calls a drunk, and cancels the Colby line for cause, and relets the road to the one clean, prosperous outfit standing ready to take it. His. That's the play. It was never about the money on the coach. It was about the book. Every sack they take, every break they saw, every hour they cost us, is another line in the government's book against us, and the book is what he's really robbing." She looked at Dan Cutter in the dark. "And the terrible part, Dan, the part I only just now see, is that we can't fight it by being robbed less. The more careful we are, the more it looks like we're hiding losses. He's built a thing where our every misfortune is our own conviction. But Vance, in his cleverness, had made one small mistake, and Maren found it 3 days later. And it was the mistake that would in the end undo him, though none of them knew it yet. The robbed-through mail sack turned up. It did not turn up burned or buried or thrown down a shaft, the way an honest road agent would have destroyed a government sack too hot to keep. It turned up cached, whole, in the abandoned halfway line shack 4 miles off the road, stuffed under a bunk where Wick Farrow, but she did not know his name yet, where a frightened young Vance stock tender had hidden it rather than do the last thing his conscience would not let him do, which was destroy the United States mail. Zeke found it, running down a strayed relay horse, and brought it in, and Maren turned the heavy padlock sack over in her hands in the lamplight and went very still, because the brass government lock that hung from it was closed and whole and had never once been forced. The letters were all inside. A sack a road agent robs is a sack a road agent breaks into. This sack had been carried off with its lock hanging shut, and hidden with its lock hanging shut, which meant it had never been robbed at all in any sense a robber would know. It had been taken by men who held the key to the boot it rode in, and had no wish to open it, only to make it disappear from the government's count. It was not a robbery, it was a bookkeeping. And the closed, unforced lock was the one hard object in the whole shapeless cruelty of that season that could be held up in a courtroom and made to say so. Maren carried the recovered mail down to Bonanza and put it in the postmaster's hands with the day and the hour and the place of its finding written down and witnessed, and she kept. Before she gave the sack over, the heavy brass lock itself worked off the hasp with Zeke's file, closed and whole and never forced, and she folded it into the back of Gideon's waybook alongside a chip of the sawn brake beam, flat like 2 pressed flowers, the theft and the murder lying quiet together between 2 pages, and she wrote under the day's entry, in her steady hand. Through mail taken below Cold Spring, recovered whole at halfway shack, lock never forced, kept the lock, and she closed the book on it. It was the first time she let herself think the word evidence, and she did not say it out loud even to Dan Cutter, because a thing like that is safest kept in the book of yourself until the day you need it in the book of the law. After the cached mail, the Vance line rode with them, not close, but always there. From the week of the first holdup on there were 2 or 3 riders, sitting their horses on a far ridge above the road in the middle distance, watching the coach string up the grade, making no move, saying nothing, there when the outfit rolled out in the dark, and there when it came in. A patience that got into the crew worse than any threat. Dan Cutter named them the Buzzards. Zeke stopped whistling at his work in the daytime, because a man does not whistle when he is being watched, and did it only at night in the Cold Spring loft where the dark was honest. And Maren drove harder and slept lighter and wrote more, because she had understood the one thing that could still beat Vance, which was that a book kept honestly and daily, run by run, sack by sack, late by late, was the one witness in the country he could not buy, poison, or dress in a flour sack, and she meant to have that witness ready and whole and dated for the day the audit came, whatever else they took from her. She had stopped, somewhere in that hard month, being afraid, and started being angry, which are 2 different weathers, and the second is more use on a grade. She said it to the whole outfit one night at the Cold Spring fire, plainly, the thing that had been assembling itself in her for a week, that Vance did not mean to make her late anymore. He meant to make her wreck. That a fouled team and a sawn brake were not the tools of a man building a paper case, but of a man who had decided the paper was too slow and meant now to break the Colby line on the grade in the dark, where no witness lived for 20 miles, and take the mail and the widow both, the way the staircase had already once been made to take her husband. I'd not blame a one of you for drawing your wage and riding clear, she told them, Zeke and Dan and old Ma Renfrew with the firelight on her seamed face. It's turned into more than a mail run. There was a silence, and Ma Renfrew spat into the fire, and Zeke Doss said quietly, I come west with a mule outfit and buried better men than Vance in worse country than this. A man don't quit a thing account of it got hard missy. That's just when it got worth finishing. And Dan Cutter said nothing at all, only got up and put another length of pine on the fire, which was his whole speech, and that was the outfit's answer. And it held. They came for the coach 4 nights later, on the staircase, in the black, and they came the way a professional does a thing, with the grade and the dark and the weather all on their side, and only the horse against them. It was a moonless night, with the first hard weather of the winter piling blue-black over the summit, and Maren was driving the down mail with Dan Cutter on the box and no passengers, the good fortune of which she thanked God for ever after. And they had topped the grade and started onto the switchbacks when 3 things happened in the space of 10 seconds that were meant to end the Colby line. For good. A wire came up out of the dark across the road at the horses' chests, strung between 2 pines at the first blind turn, meant to cut and panic the leaders and pile the team, and at the same instant a pistol went off in the timber below, and a man's voice yelled the team on, and under Maren's boot, set to let go on the first hard break of the descent, the way the other one had. The brake beam cracked clean across and the pedal went dead to the floor. Sawn brake, strung wire, and a gun in the dark, all at once on the worst turn of the grade. It was the staircase wreck built again on purpose. And it would have worked on any team in the territory but the one she had. The wire caught the near leader across the chest, and the horse screamed and reared, and the whole team surged and swung toward the drop, and the dead brake coach lunged forward down the grade, and for one instant it was 2 winters ago exactly, and the mountain had them. And then the near wheel horse set his black legs. Smoke felt the coach come onto him and the team break toward the edge and the gun go off behind, and the cold nerve that no cruelty had ever taught to panic did the one thing it knew, which was to throw all 17 hands of himself back into the breeching and hold, and he took the strung wire himself across the point of the shoulder doing it. A man on foot in the timber had jerked the wire tight against him on purpose as he set, a long raking tear opening down his chest as he threw his weight back, and he never quit the hold. He held the runaway on his own cut chest, while Maren sawed the panicked leaders' heads back off the edge with all her weight on the lines, and Dan Cutter went off the box into the dark with his gun out toward the pistol flash, and between the woman on the lines and the horse in the breeching the down coach came around the blind turn hard against the inside wall and shuddered to a stop against the bank with 2 wheels in the ditch and the mail still aboard and no soul over the edge. But it cost. It cost Dan Cutter, who caught one of Tolliver's men in the timber and took a fall down a boulder slope, wrestling him in the dark, and came up with the man gone, and his own left arm broke clean below the elbow, and a gash along his scalp that sheeted his face with blood. And it cost the mail. Because while the woman and the horse fought the front of the wreck, the rest of Tolliver's men did in the dark the thing the whole ambush had been built to let them do. They cut the rear boot and took the 2 through sacks of the down mail and were gone south into the timber toward the blind canyon off the roaring fork, where the iron of their scheme was heating. And by the time there was light to count by the trail of them was cold, and it cost the horse most of all. Maren did not find the whole of it until Zeke came up from Cold Spring with a lantern in the gray dawn. Because Smoke had said nothing, had stood the rest of that black night in the traces, holding the wreck coach off the ditch, with the thing done to him, and never once laid back an ear. But when the light came she found the near shoulder, and the point of the chest laid open in a long raking tear, cut to the muscle and crusted black down the leg, and she knew the wound the instant she saw it. Because it was a wire cut, and there had been no wire on that road until a man strung one at the chest of her team on purpose. and had jerked it tight against the one horse holding the whole outfit off the mountain, and had failed, because the horse held the coach anyway, with his chest torn open, and never quit. Maren stitched him that morning by full light on the ruined switchback, kneeling in the frozen dirt, with the wrecked coach canted in the ditch behind her, and Dan Cutter gray, and splinted against a pine, and Zeke holding the lantern and the horse's head, and she did it the way her harness-maker father had taught her at 11, and the way she had once seen her husband do it. With a curved needle and a length of waxed thread, 14 stitches to close the long tear, and the great stallion stood for it with his head down and his breath going slow and warm against her back, and never flinched from the needle, though he had fought a whip and a snubbing post, and a loaded quirt to a standstill in his life, because he was not afraid of what was in this hand, and had never been, and never would be. She talked to him the whole time, low, the way you talk to steady yourself and not the horse, telling him he was worth 10 of them, worth the whole Vance line and the man that owned it, telling him Gideon had been right and the country wrong, and somewhere in the middle of it, 14 stitches into the chest of a horse the territory had told her to shoot for $1. Maren Colby finally. Quietly, kneeling in the frozen dirt with her hands full of thread and blood, cried, the first time in 2 years and more, cried for Gideon and the 2 lean springs and the poisoned team and the taken mail and the broke-armed man against the pine and the torn brave horse. Cried it all out silent, with her forehead against the warm gray neck, while she tied off the last stitch. And then she wiped her face on her sleeve and stood up and was done with it. Because there was a wrecked coach to get out of a ditch, and a mail to account for, and a broke driver to get down to a doctor, and a widow who has cried her one cry is not weaker for it, but lighter, and she knew the difference now. Dan Cutter had watched the last of it from against his pine, gray with his broke arm. And when she stood, he said, low, so Zeke would not hear, that's the best piece of field doctoring I ever saw done, and the bravest horse I ever saw stand it. He paused and worked his good hand once against the splint, and said the rest of it, which was as near as Dan Cutter ever came in all that season to the thing under everything. Your husband left you a good horse, Maren. But the horse didn't hold that coach on the grade tonight. You did, on the lines, in the dark. Don't you let this country tell it any other way, and don't you tell it that way to yourself. And then, because it was more than he had said in 2 years, and more than either of them could yet hold, he let Zeke help him up and turned it into work. And they got the coach out of the ditch and the down mail, what was left of it, on to Bonanza a day late and 2 sacks short, another black line for the government's book, and behind them in the blind canyon off the roaring fork, the taken sacks lay cashing up with the others, and ahead of them, the first great storm of that killing winter was already piling itself over the summit and starting, quietly, to come down the grade. She got Dan Cutter down to the county seat to a doctor for the arm, and it was there, in the one town on the route with a deputy and a newspaper and eyes, that she met the sharpest mind she came on all that season, and got the 2 things she most needed: the shape of Vance's last move and the way to beat it. The newspaper was the Rampart Bugle, and the man who got it out once a week on a hand press in a shed behind the harness shop was named Ephraim Nash, a stooped, gray, coughing man of about 50, who had been a lawyer somewhere back east before the consumption, and some private grief drove him west to die slower than the doctors had promised, and who had, under the ink and the cough, the quickest eye Maren met on the whole Rampart. He came to her at the wheelwrights the morning Enoch Bar, the old coach Smith was setting the wrecked coach to rights, because a widow carrying the winter mail with a broke driver, a stitched outlaw horse, and 2 sacks robbed off the staircase was the best story to roll into the county seat in a year of Sundays. And he sat on an upturned nail keg with his notebook and listened to the whole of it, the meeting and the toll and the ford and the fouled team and the 2 holdups, and he stopped her only twice. He stopped her the first time when she showed him the brass mail lock she carried in the waybook, closed and whole and never forced. He turned it over in his ink-stained fingers and held it to the light, and his tired eyes came alive. "Do you know what you have here, Mrs. Colby?" he said. "You have the whole robbery undone in one object. A road agent robs a sack, he breaks the lock to get the letters, because the letters are the only thing in a mail sack worth a robber's risk. This lock was never touched. A sack carried off whole and hidden whole, locked shut, was not robbed by any man who wanted what was in it. It was made to vanish by men who had the key to the boot and only wanted the government's count to come up short. That is not a robbery, ma'am. That is a bookkeeping dressed as a robbery, and the lock is the confession." He stopped her the second time when old Enoch Barr, listening from the forge, brought over the sawn brake beam and laid it by the honest broken one for the newspaperman to see, and Nash looked from the one to the other a long moment, and said, softly, the thing that made the case. "A break and a cut are not the same wound, and no lawyer alive can argue them into one. An honest beam under too much load tears along its grain, it splinters, it frays, it fails ugly and every which way, because wood is a bundle of fibers, and it lets go fiber by fiber. A sawn beam parts clean and flat and square across the grain, and leaves the saw's own scoring in the face of the cut, and sawdust in the low corner of the kerf, because a saw does not tear wood, it powders it. Any wheelwright in the territory can hold these two beams to a window and tell a jury to a certainty which one an honest grade broke, and which one a fine saw parted in the dark. And you have 3 of them now. Mrs. Colby, the one off your coach tonight, the one Mr. Barkeep says he pulled 2 winters back off the wreck that took your husband, and the one still on the coach the robbers didn't reach. Wood remembers how it was parted. It does not forget, and it cannot be bribed." He coughed and folded the lock back into her hand as though it were made of gold. "Keep every scrap, write down every hour, and God help the stage king." Then he told her the thing she had not known and needed to, and it was the shape of the trap. Vance had wired ahead. There was a message that very week gone down the wire from the Vance office to a lawyer at the county seat, plain enough for the operator and thus for the town to read, instructing that counsel to prepare a complaint against one Maren Colby, not a defense of Vance. A complaint against her, charging that the widow had staged the robberies on her own line and embezzled the government mail herself to collect on the bond and cover the losses of an outfit she could not run, and offering as proof the very sacks that would be found, when the marshal looked, cashed and recovered in the widow's own possession. "He means to have you arrested when you bring the audit mail in," Nash said, "for stealing the very mail his men stole from you and hid where you would find it, so that your finding it would hang you. It is the most shameless thing I have read off a wire in 20 years, and it will very nearly work, because on its face, a widow holding recovered government mail she cannot fully account for looks exactly like a mail thief. Very nearly." He stood, gathering his thin coat around his chest, and there was something in his ruined face that had not been there when he sat down. A man who had found. At the frayed end of his life, one more thing worth doing. I am going to print your story, Mrs. Colby, all of it, this week, before the audit, the toll and the ford, the fouled team, the 2 robberies, the unforced lock, the 3 sawn beams, so that when Vance swears his complaint there is already an account in type in this territory that says the widow told it the other way first, with the dates and the objects and his own wire from his own office. I cannot ride your grade, and I cannot try your case, but by God I can put the truth in type where a judge can read it, and wire it to the territorial paper besides. He coughed. It is not much. It is what I have left in me to do. He did not know he had all but quoted a dead man. Maren heard it, and did not correct him, and shook his ink-stained hand with both of hers. The last piece of it came to her out of the opening storm 2 nights later, on a wind-broke horse, and it was a boy. A young man, rather, for she would not let him call himself less before it was over. He came up the division road in the first hard snow of the winter, and sat his blown horse at the edge of the lamplight, with his thin face pinched and gray and afraid and set. And Maren walked out to him before any of the others could, and stood at his stirrup looking up. "I couldn't stay, Ms. Colby." The words came out of him in a rush, the way a young man confesses. "Name's Wick Farrow. I tend stock for the Vance line, out of the Bonanza yard. On account of it was the only wage in this country, and I got no people. And I've held horses for Roof Tolliver all fall, and told myself it weren't my business what the men done. And then he had me, file a kingbolt one night, and saw a break another, showing us how, laughing, and string a wire across the staircase in the dark, and I seen a man jerk that wire tight against your gray horse, on purpose. And I held horses 2 nights back when they took your down mail, and I hid the one sack under the halfway bunk myself, because I couldn't burn the mail. Ms. Colby. My ma set store by the mail when I was small, and I just couldn't. And I got up this morning and I couldn't hold no more horses either." His voice cracked clean across. "I know where the Sachs is at. There's a blind canyon off the roaring fork above the falls, a box straw with a brush corral. They got your mail cached there. All of it. 4 runs of it, waiting on the audit to pass so they can burn it safe. Tolliver's got 2 men holding it. I come to tell you. And to give myself up to the law after, whatever it costs me, because I held the horses and that makes me one of them. And I'd sooner hang honest than winter warm on a Vance wage one more night." Maren Colby reached up and put her hand on the young man's knee, and every soul at the fire went still to hear her. "You didn't hold horses, Wick Farrow," she said gently. "You rode a broke horse through the start of a blizzard to bring a widow the truth and to give up your own neck for it. And you couldn't burn the mail because your mother raised you right. That's not what one of Tolliver's men does. That's the bravest thing I've heard tell of any man doing on this whole road, and I'll say so to the judge with my hand on the book. Now get down and get to that fire. You're home." And Wick Farrow got down off the wind-broke horse and stumbled to the fire, and Ma Renfrew, who had come down for the audit week, put a plate in his hands, and more when he wept into the first one, and said nothing, the way she had said nothing to 100 cold travelers over 11 years. That night, by the way books light, with the snow ticking at the window and the audit 3 days off, Maren and Dan and Zeke made the hard plan, and it was the horse's plan in the end. To carry the audit eve mail down to the county seat on time was to hold the contract by a thread, but to arrive with 4 runs of mail still lost in a canyon was to hand the auditor the shortfall Vance needed and walk straight into Vance's arrest for the sacks she could not produce. To ride off after the cashed mail was to leave the audit run undriven and lose the contract for lateness. So they did the thing that could not be done, which was both, and they did it in the teeth of the coming storm, because the storm, Maren saw, was not only their enemy. "Tolliver's got 2 men holding my mail in a brush corral up a blind draw," she said, "and there's a blizzard coming down this grade that Vance is too proud to drive his fine teams ahead of. Those 2 men are about to be a great deal more worried about freezing than about guarding my sacks. The storm empties that canyon for us. Zeke takes the storm up the roaring fork and brings my mail out while they've run for a fire. And I drive the audit mail down the staircase behind smoke, in the whiteout, because there is exactly 1 horse in this territory that will face a blind grade in a blizzard, and he's ours, and I'll put the recovered sacks and the audit mail on the auditor's counter the same hour, whole and counted, and let Harlan Vance swear whatever he likes to a room that's looking at the mail he said I stole." Dan Cutter looked at her a long moment across the lamp, his arm in its sling, and then he almost smiled, the second time that season, and said, "Gideon'd have said the same." And I'm driving that grade with you, one arm or no, so don't waste breath. Get some sleep. It'll be the worst day any of us ever put in. The blizzard came down off the summit before dawn on the day of the audit run. Not the soft feathering snow of a Christmas card, but the killing kind. A horizontal white roar of wind and ground blizzard that took the world away 3 feet past a horse's ears and dropped the cold through zero and kept dropping. The storm that in that hard winter would catch 1,000 head of loose stock in the fence corners and empty the open range of every outfit too proud to drive its animals to shelter. And into that white nothing Maren Colby put the condemned Stallion at the near wheel and drove the United States mail down the staircase, and the horse took them through. It was the cold nerve that did it, in the end, the very thing the country had condemned. A sound-eyed, honest coach horse is ruled by what it sees. And in a whiteout it sees only screaming white, and it will not face the grade. But Smoke had set his fear down 2 years back and never picked it up, and a whiteout to him was only a louder dark, and he leaned his cut chest into the breeching and held the coach back off the leader's turn after blind turn, feeling the grade under his black legs where no eye could read it. While Maren drove by the pull of the road and the memory in her hands, and Dan Cutter called the leaders on one armed from the box, and Ma Renfrew, who had crept out to the last switchback above Cold Spring on her cane in the roar, stood swinging a lantern high in the white to mark the turn where the grade fell away, so that the down mail came around the last blind bend toward the one gold point. Of light an old woman held against the storm and made the flat, and made the county seat, and made it whole. And while the woman and the horse brought the audit mail down the grade, Zeke Doss took the storm up the roaring fork to the blind canyon, and found it as Maren had bet their whole cause it would be. The 2 men Tolliver had set to guard the cached mail gone. Run for the Bonanza line camp ahead of the cold the way a hired man does when the wage stops being worth the dying, leaving 4 runs of stolen government mail stacked whole in a brush corral under a tarp, and Zeke loaded every sack and cut loose from the pine at the canyon mouth a length of the same bright fence wire, and found snagged on its barb, frozen stiff, a long torn strip of greasy gray wool ripped from the skirt of a coat he had last seen on Roof Tolliver at a chained bridge, and he folded that fact away with the sacks and rode down the storm to the county seat and put the 4 recovered mails on the post office counter beside the audit mail the same hour Maren drove in, whole and counted. The whole season's theft undone and stacked in the light, 1 hour before Harlan Vance meant to have her arrested for stealing it. Vance was there, because a proud man cannot stay away from the place his enemy will be either broken or dangerous, and he had made, with his lawyer's help, his last and cleverest arrangement. He had a complaint sworn and a deputy waiting, charging the widow with staging her own robberies and embezzling the mail, and the proof of it was to be the recovered sacks in her own possession. And it was, laid flat on the counter, the most beautiful trap Vance had ever built, for on its face a widow who produced the very mail the road agents had taken looked exactly like the road agent. If the thing were read the plain way, her own recovered honesty would hang her, the contract would be canceled for a route under a cloud of mail theft, the bond would fall, and Harlan Vance would ride home, having lost nothing but a season's wages to Tolliver, and gained the richest road in the territory. "I'm sorry it comes to this, Maren," Vance said, hat in his hand. And the terrible thing was that some rind of him meant it. Mail theft's a federal matter, a prison matter. But I'll speak for leniency. On account of Gideon, if he'll sign the contract over and let it be settled quiet. He was being kind. "No," Maren said. "We'll let it be read in the open, Mr. Vance, before witnesses. The way you like a thing done. I'll trust the wood and the lock." and she asked the deputy, in a voice that carried out into the street, to send for the mail route agent and for Judge Alonzo Petrie, who was, as God and Harlan Vance's ill luck would have it, holding circuit at the county seat that very week, and had already, at a road meeting a lifetime ago, taken his cigar out of his mouth to study a small gray woman doing sums out loud. They held the hearing the next morning in the county seat courtroom, and the whole road came, and half the territory that could get through the snow, and it was as public as anything Vance had ever staged, only this time he was not staging it. The route agent was a spare, unbuyable man named Hollis Ray, sent up to audit the losses, and he was invited first to inspect the recovered mail. And he took the heavy brass lock off the through sack in front of the room and turned it in a loop and said, in the dry voice of a man reading a fact off an object, "This lock has never been forced. There is not a scratch on the shackle nor a mark on the hasp. A sack whose lock was never forced was never robbed of its contents by anyone who wanted them. It was removed whole and hidden whole. And the Colby Way book," he said, taking up the greasy book Maren laid open before him, "shows the best on-time record on the Rampart Road these 90 days. Forded rivers and doubled teams and all, a record no outfit trying to rob itself would trouble to keep. Whatever happened to this mail, Your Honor, the woman who kept this book did not steal it." Then, old Enoch Barr, the coachwright, was called, and he laid 3 brake beams across the clerk's table, the one sawn off Maren's coach on the staircase, the honest one broken under load in a common wreck, and the one he swore he had drawn 2 winters back off the coach that took Gideon Colby, and he held them one by one to the courtroom window where the snowlight came through. And he showed the room what wood does not forget, the honest beam torn ragged along its grain, splintered every which way, the way load breaks wood, and the 2 sawn beams parted clean and flat and square across the grain. The fine parallel scoring of the saw plain in the smooth faces, the dry sawdust still packed in the low corners of the kerfs, 2 winters and one apart. "A grade broke this one," Enoch Barr said, tapping the honest beam, "and a saw parted these 2, and the same fine saw at that, by the set of the teeth. I'll stake my forge on it. And the second saw cut, Your Honor, is off the wreck that this country has called a drunk driver's fault for 2 years." The courtroom made a sound then, low, like wind. And Dan Cutter sat very still, with his broke arm in its sling, and his face working, 2 winters of a lie parting clean across, in front of the same men who had crossed the street on him. After that it came apart for Harlan Vance, the way a coach comes apart on a grade, all at once, and in every direction. Maren put Gideon's dated way book in the judge's hands, and it walked the court up the road run by run, the $50 toll, the fouled team, the 2 mails taken, each sack numbered and dated, and its recovery witnessed. She put on the stand young Wick Farrow, who told it with his hat in his hands and his voice shaking, and never once looked at Vance. How Tolliver had taught them to file a king bolt and saw a break. How he had strung the wire and seen a man jerk it tight against the gray horse on purpose. How he had hidden the 1 sack because he could not burn the mail. And how he had ridden a broke horse through the blizzard to give it all up and take his medicine. And the court, looking at that thin young man choosing to hang honest rather than winter warm, understood it was hearing the truth. She put on Zeke Doss, grave and unshakable, who had found the cashed mail and cut the wire, and laid on the clerk's table the frozen strip of greasy gray wool, ripped from a coat the whole road had seen on Roof Tolliver's back. And Tolliver, who might have brazened out any one thing, could not sit still under all of them at once, and got up in the middle of it, and walked out of the courtroom, and out of the county seat, and out of the territory, and was not seen in the Rampart country again, which the grand jury took, correctly, for an answer. And while the courtroom was still roaring, the last of it came in off the storm on a half-frozen rider, the news that the blizzard had emptied the open grade. Vance, too proud and too greedy to wait, had staged his own fine matched teams and 3 new coaches at the relays along the summit to seize the route the hour the widow failed, and had held them there loose on the open grade a day too long to save the cost of driving them down to shelter, and the killing winter had caught them where they stood, and the stage king's own teams, worth a fortune in the daylight of a livery, had drifted and scattered and been lost in the coulees and the fence corners with no still hand and no cold-nerved horse to hold them, ruined in the one dark he had never reckoned on. He was undone that week, not by Maren Colby, but by the single arithmetic his money had never taught him, which was that any horse will pull on the flat. And the grade asks what he has left when the load turns to kill you both, and Harlan Vance's fine teams, that had never once been asked what they had left after dark, had nothing. And neither, in the end, did he. He walked out of that courtroom a smaller man than had walked in, and he did not stop being smaller. Judge Alonzo Petrie cleared Maren Colby of everything in one dry sentence, restored the recovered mail and the Bonanza contract to the Colby line on the record, cleared Dan Cutter of the staircase wreck 2 winters buried, and referred Harlan Vance and Ruth Tolliver to the grand jury for the sabotage, the fouling of a public relay, the theft of the government mail, and the death of Gideon Colby on a sawn break. And then, before he rapped his gavel, he did a thing not strictly in the law. He looked over his spectacles at the small gray woman, and then out the courtroom door to where the Grulla Stallion could be seen standing hip-shot and patient in the churned snow of the street, the 14 stitches dark on his chest, the lightning blaze pale on his lowered face, and he said, dry as ever, to the whole room, I have sat this bench 20 years, and I have watched this territory decide the worth of a woman and the worth of a horse by looking at the one thing about each it was too lazy to see past. It has cost the territory, by my count this morning, 1 stage king, 1 runoff road boss, and its own good name. That outlaw horse the country told the widow to shoot for $1 just carried the mail that cleared her down a blizzard grade 3 fine teams couldn't face. Court's adjourned. Somebody go get that stallion a warm stall. She paid the bond that same week over Josiah Frame's own counter in the county seat bank, $2,600 in government mail warrants and hard coin, in front of whoever cared to watch, and folded the canceled paper into the back of Gideon's waybook beside the sawn chip and the brass lock, the loss and its ending pressed flat together like 2 pages of one story, and she drove home to the division under a sky-washed clean. The Colby line made an outfit that winter, out of the people the country had thrown away. Zeke Doss took the division agent's desk at an agent's wage and an agent's respect, both a long time overdue, and ran the Rampart Road for 30 years. Ma Renfrew kept the Cold Spring swing till she died in her own bed, by her own hearth 9 winters on, which is the death a station keeper prays for. Wick Farrow, cleared by his own honesty and the judge's mercy, grew that winter into the kind of man he had ridden through a blizzard to become, and drove the upper grade for the line before he was 30. And the country, which had crossed the street on Dan Cutter for 2 years over a lie a sawn break told, heard the whole of that lie undone in one morning, and the crossing of the street reversed itself, as those things do. Too late to be worth much, and just in time to matter. He stayed. He had never quite left, all that winter, finding reasons about the stock and the coaches, and one evening at the tail of it, with the ice going off the Roaring Fork and the first green coming to the division bench, Dan Cutter stood at Maren's gate with his hat in his hands and his mended arms sound again, and did not make a speech, because he was not a man who made them. I've got no name worth much, though it's worth more this spring than last, he said, looking out at the gray horse on the good grass and not at the woman, and a quarter section up a dry draw, and a set of hands. But I've drifted about as far as a man wants to drift. There's a place at your fire, if ever you'd have a man stop drifting at it. Maren Colby looked at him a while, the way the horse looked at a new thing, taking her time, and then she said, "There's a coach wants the best whip on the road, and a line wants a partner, and a fire wants a man that knows when not to fill the quiet. Unroll your bed, Dan. Stay." And that was all, and it was enough, and there was no kiss at the gate that spring for the country to talk about. Only a lamp that burned later in the division kitchen than a widow's lamp had burned in 2 years, and after a while a quiet wedding at the little church at the county seat that the sewing circle came to, and behaved themselves at, and the stallion turned out on the greenest grass of the bench to graze while it went on. He lived a long time. Smoke, the wire scar healed to a seam under the gray. 14 stitches worth, and Maren never once let anyone forget how it got there or what it had held. He carried the mail at the near wheel another 11 winters, down the staircase and across the roaring fork ford and up the summit in every weather God sent, and he went gray at the muzzle at the last, and it changed nothing at all, because he had set his fear down as a young horse, and had none left to lose to age, and he answered a still hand to the end, and would fight a raised one to the end, and never in his life confused the two. And when he lay down at last in the deep grass of the division bench and did not get up, they buried him on the rise above the yard beside Gideon, and hung Gideon's heavy silver watch on a nail by the cold spring hearth where the next driver could hear it tick the mail out on time. On the watch and not the weather, the way the man had taught the woman and the woman had taught the road. Gideon Colby used to say a thing over the worst of the grades, the thing that had gotten his widow up off a sleet-stormed doorway and out onto 140 miles of winter road no one thought she could hold. He said any horse will pull on the flat, any fool with a fat team and a fair day can look fine at the depot. The grade asks what a thing is left when the load turns to kill you both. And most everything folks throw away, he said, every outlaw horse and street-crossed man, and used-up widow the country has already priced at $1, and quit troubling to look at. Most of it is not broke at all. It is only waiting, quiet, at the foot of the grade where nobody bothers to look, on the kind of dark and the kind of weight that finally shows the world what it was always for.